All right, hello guys. So you're free to draw on the board. I will allow because I noticed that people tend to ask question more if they draw on the board. So I will allow annotation, but only annotate if you have a real question, so that like make a question mark or something. And you can see on the PowerPoint that it states Introduction to Web Development, and yes, it's JavaScript time. Actually, it's not. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about how you can send over files over a network and how you actually connect your HTML with CSS and how browser renders it, and how you could include a little bit of JavaScript to make your website look better. Also, we're going to talk about the float, which is something new. Actually, it's not new, but we haven't touched on that. It basically allows you to have some kind of parallelism between your elements. So you could have same, let's say, two block element. If you remember, a block element cannot be on the same line unless you specify it as float or whatever, some stuff else. So it allows you to have parallel block element, like two block element on a single row instead of starting a new line. We're gonna look into that soon. Going over the slides about me, you probably already know, so yeah. And the topic we'll cover, well, this is extremely outdated, so okay. This is the part we actually, oh, oops, my bad. This is the part that we actually cares about. I mean, we actually care about. Oh, sorry, wrong slide. Sending HTML from a server. A server is a computer in the cloud, right? Somewhere in the internet. And your client is just your browser. Essentially, when you type in a URL or universal resource locator, such as webproject.com, it will find the IP address of that host. So webproject.com in this case is the host. I don't know if this website actually exists or not. I just came out with it. That will be your host. Your computer will first ask the DNS service to find the actual IP address of that server. After you found the IP address, which is basically the locator for any computer in the cloud, it's kind of like your own address. You can find any computer with the proper IP address. After you found the IP address, your browser will make a request to the IP address of the webproject.com, since you enter that. And you basically, in your request, of course, it's not going to be, hey, I want to browse. But the meaning is just that I'm trying to browse your website, and can you get me, that's a verb, can you get me an HTML page? Or sometimes you might get JSON. Your browser will tell you server what to ask for, like HTML or JSON, but server can decide what to give you. In this case, the server will listen to your request and process it. After processing it, it will send you a response. That response will have a header explaining what type of response it is. In this case, the header tells us that the response is HTML. There will also be a status code, kind of like 200, which means okay. You might have noticed when you're browsing the web that there are status code like 404, right? Resource cannot be found. That's a typical error status code. And the body of the request will just be the HTML page. A simple HTML page without any styling looks really boring, and it might look something like this. your browser takes in the HTML and will draw it on your screen. And that's how you see a boring web page like that. By the way, that's the first website ever made. And how do we make it more interesting? I guess you probably have known that already from the last lesson, that we use CSS or Cascadian style sheet to make our web page look better. You could use a CSS style root to tell your browser that, hey, when you see a paragraph, make it larger or something like that, or draw a box. You can achieve all of those through CSS. And then, so we must request a CSS page. In the HTML tag that your browser sends you, the file will contain a link tag. I'll show you what that looks like. Notice here we have HTML. This is exactly what our browser will receive if we host this on the server and we request this file from that server. Our browser will receive this index.html page. From this, you can see that there's a link tag. This is called a link tag, obviously. And it links you to an external style sheet, like a CSS tag. You can see that href or href, this is just a link to an external style sheet. And relation style sheet, meaning the style sheet. And this will actually allow your browser to fetch a CSS file. And then after your browser get the CSS file, it will take that file and draw your HTML page based on that CSS style sheet. In our case, since this is usually relative to your file location, but it also depends on how your server is structured. In our case, the server is structured in the way that it serves the files by the folder. So that's how we can actually access this file here by simply doing href equals to style.css. Now, this is a perfect time to ask questions. So if you have questions, just annotate on the screen. And going back to here, there's two ways your browser can actually render a file. The first way is that your file is in your file system, and your browser will read it through your file system. I will show you what it looks like. Let me find some. Actually, I can't find anything right now. All right, I'm not gonna show it then. But just it's usually for debugging your HTML file. I will show you that later. Another one, which is a typical one, is that your browser asks a remote server, and that server will send you an HTML file. If you have a question, you can draw, but if you don't have a question, please don't draw random stuff. After your browser receives your HTML page, it will check. So in our HTML page, it contains a link tag, right? It will look for this link tag. After finding it, it will make another additional request to that server asking, hey, I saw a link tag in my HTML file, and it's pointing to a resource on your machine. So can you give me that CSS file? And sure, the browser will say, and it will give you the CSS file. And that's how your browser gathers up the CSS file, and then it will just style your HTML page with the CSS file sent by the browser. So that's how it works. That's why we need a link tag here, href equals to style.css. That's the location of that CSS file. And those, generally, I just copy and paste these things because no need to remember them. And yeah, that's how you link to a style sheet. A thing worth pointing out is that you can actually write some kind of style without linking to a style sheet. I'm just showing you how this works. You have a style tag, and inside of it, you could just write CSS as if you're in the CSS file. So that's how you write CSS in HTML, like that. But I don't recommend doing this because there's a thing called separation of concern. You want to separate your CSS file from your HTML file. All right, back to our lecture. Sending JavaScript is the same idea. You will include a script tag instead of the typical link tag, and that script tag will actually point to an address on whatever server you have. Your server will just give you back the JavaScript. After receiving the JavaScript, your browser will execute it, just like how it will render the HTML page again based on the CSS rule you send. When it receives a JavaScript, it will execute the code and do some cool stuff. A thing worth pointing out is that your script tag and your link tag don't have to be pointing to the same server that you requested the HTML page from. So you could request an HTML page from Google, but you could have a style sheet, a link tag pointing to a style sheet at, like, for example, youtube.com, and they will fetch that style sheet for you, even though they're not from google.com. So it doesn't have to be the same origin. This is something called COR, and if you're interested, and if you see some COR error in your future coding career, you can search it up, and that's basically it. Same origin or different origin. This is what a HTTP request might look like. You have a GET, which means it gets. This is a really simplified version of an HTTP request. There will usually be much more to it. And the response looks typically very similar to the request, except that it has a response body and the request has a request body. In a response, that would just be your HTML page, like that. And now we're doing some practical stuff. Before we get into any coding, though, I have to explain what is a CSS container. Actually, a CSS container is just an element that contains other elements. So if you look at this graph here, this image, you have a div. You really should have known what a div element is by now. A div element is like a specially made element, default element for making container and stuff. But it doesn't have. But a container doesn't have to be a div. It's block element. That means it takes up a new line unless you specify float or other stuff. So you can notice here that this div tag, this part, I will annotate a little bit. This is your enclosing tag, an opening tag. Notice how this div wraps around two tags. It wraps around the span tag and the paragraph tag. In this case, we could say that the div tag is a parent container of the span tag and the p tag. P stands for paragraph, by the way. And also, vice versa, we could say the span tag and the p tag in this image are said to be the child element of the div tag. So those are just some basic vocabulary. You have div, you have container, parent container, which contains stuff. You also have child element, or sometimes you call them child node if you're programming in JavaScript. In HTML, you call them child elements. In this case, child elements are the span and the p, and the parent container is the div tag. Makes sense, right? So any question at this point? If you have any question, you can draw on the screen, or if you have any question, just draw a big question mark like this. All right, I don't see anybody drawing, so good. Everyone's good. If you're good, maybe draw a like yes here, like draw a Nike check here if you're good. If you get the topic, so we can move on. All right. I see a yes. Thank you. All right. Thank you. Thank you guys for participating in this little game. Let's move on. And just remember your vocabulary: parent container, child elements. Very simple. And the effect will just be the span tag, and the div tag will be inside the div container. Very simple, but very useful. CSS float. Now this is really getting interesting. Before we had introduced the CSS float, we could only write HTML and make website that is going from top to down. What does that actually mean? That means if we have two div elements, they must be one on top of each other. No matter how small they are, they will take out the entire length of the web page. So a second div element, no matter how small the first one is, the second one will always start on a new line. Like if you can see my hand gesture here, yeah, it makes a little bit of sense. And like a flow from top to down, right? A float basically takes the element from the normal flow of up to down and float it in another direction. So instead of up to down, you could have left to right. A thing that people usually get confused is that when you use a float with a paragraph, let's say you have look into the image here, you have the float left. You have this float left here. This actually, yeah, just float it to the left. You can see that doesn't matter where you place the image here in your HTML document, it will always be rendered on the left side. And the paragraph here will be in normal flow. You can see that the paragraph will wrap around the image. This is a cool feature, and that's why the float was initially built. But now float can be used to do a lot of cool stuff. And for this one, you can see that this is just a very special property that you have to remember. When you have a float of image, when you have an image tag that is floating to the left, when you have an image that is floating to the left, and you have a paragraph, Apple Pen, and you have a paragraph, that paragraph will automatically wrap around the image so that your image will be on the left and the text will be around it. More practical stuff. This really explains the normal flow. You have this normal flow here. Notice how I have 3 div document. The first div go on top, the second one stack beneath it, the third one stack beneath it. It's kind of like an inverse stack of plates, right? Except that it is inverse. So it's stacking from bottom to top. You have the first one, so you go to the very top, and then the second one goes right underneath it, starting on a new line. The third one goes right underneath the second one. That is your normal flow of document. And this happens when if you set the float of all the divs to the left. First one, it appears normal, right? That's because there's nothing else to show. This actually is already pulled out of the normal float of the document, and now it's actually gonna always be on the left since you set the float left to true. This is what happens if you set the float of div to the left. So it will always be on the left no matter what happens. So since it's the first one. The second one, if you also set the float left of the second one, it will float to the left, but you notice that there's already a thing on the left side, and that's our first div. So instead of being on the very left, it will stack to the left side, to the right side of the div. So it'll become like this. You can see where this is going. So the third one will stack on top of the second one, or on the right side of the second one. This is float to the left, the first one, be the very left. The second one, it is also floating to the left, but there's already a div on the left side, so it will just go stack on the right side of that div. And third one, this is also supposed to be on the very left, but there's already two divs annoyingly blocking the path. So that's why it have to settle for the very right. So that's how it works. And if you have a fourth div, and now you're out of the space, the fourth div will actually go around them to start a new line. And fifth div will just go beneath the second div. So it works by that way. So remember, when the element is floated to the left, it will first always try to squeeze to the very left of the parent container. Vocabulary here, the parent container, which is we previously talked about. The parent container is just whatever that contains that element. It will always try to squeeze to the left of the parent container. And if that won't work, it will just stack on top of the previous one or stack on the right. So you have first one squeeze to the very left. The second one will try to go to the very left, but it's blocked. So it will stack up. And the third one will just stack up one more time. And so like going this way, so it's from left to right. If you have flow to left, set on every element. The fourth one, sadly, there's no more space, so it will settle for the very left of the second line. That's how it works, really. And vice versa. If you set the flow to the right, it will, of course, what do you expect? Will just flow to the right. It's kind of like the gravity is now on the left side if you set the flow to the left. So the gravity is attracting the first one to the left, second one stack on top of that, third one on top of the second one. Very easy. All right, we have go through 20 minutes of theory. Now we should actually write some code. I'm gonna actually use this computer now. Can you guys still hear me? Can you guys like say in the chat, can you guys hear me? All right, thank you. This light is kind of blocking. All right, so remember it's REPL. If you don't remember, REPL is just a website. You type in RPLEL. I think most of you know this. If you're new, just typing REPL. This is the website that we'll be writing code in. Go to My REPL or click on New REPL. And if it prompts you to log in, just log in with your Google account.
HTML, JavaScript, CSS, and make a new repository, just like that. I'll just show you. All right, I was planning on teach JavaScript, but there's more important stuff to teach. That is CSS float. So we're probably are not gonna learn JavaScript today since CSS float is much more important, but hopefully JavaScript for next lesson. And you will notice that you have style.css and index.html. Remember, since we have this link tag here, whatever you write to the style.css will be linked to the index.html. And this way, whatever styling rule you write in style.css will be applied to your HTML page here. And if you want to create a new style sheet, like new styles, this by default won't be linked to the HTML page. So like if you have a new one, to make them link to the HTML page, you will have to make another link tag. So I copy and pasted a new link tag. And here I changed the style.css to new style.css. This way, my HTML document will tell my browser, hey, there's another CSS file that we haven't used yet. So my browser will look for the CSS file and will draw it. I will apply the rules to my HTML document. All right, but I won't be using this because this is terrible. You can use this. I'm gonna use a code editor called Bracket, and it's pretty convenient because I can split screen and to show you the code better. But for you, you can just use this repo code editor, and when you have like CSS, just go to your CSS file, and when you have HTML, just go to your HTML file. I'll be using brackets since you can see that the advantage is that you can see both at the same screen. Also, Bracket has a live server. We're just setting up so that you can see. All right, there you go. Making my font larger. Okay. Let's just try making some span elements. So we have a body here. We don't really need this div. So I'm gonna delete that div. And I'm gonna write code into the body tag. I'm going to make a div element, div1, another one, div2. And I have this styling that I defined for my div element. I'm gonna remove the float left so you can see the difference. So I have width to 50 pixel, height to 50 pixel. So it's a box, and background color to yellow. So it's a yellow box, and border to 1 pixel solid black. Now if I refresh this, oops, nothing showed up. That's strange. Let me check. Debugging time. Oh, maybe because I haven't. All right, there you go. So you can see I applied this styling, which is self-explanatory to my div here. I have div element 1, this div is this div, and this div tag is this box here. I don't know why is it not shown. It should be reflecting the whatever. So I'm gonna make a new one. Oh, live server. It's not actually a live server. Never mind. All right. I have 3 divs here. You can see that a div will always try to squeeze on a new line. Let's give it a margin something. Margin, the first element will be the top margin. So let's give a margin top of 10 pixel. It goes from top, right, down, and left. Top, right, bottom, and left. So the second one will be the margin on the right side. You can see on my screen that this is very nicely laid out for you. That's why I like this editor a lot. So left 10 pixel, right 10 pixel. This is just saying we want margin on top 10 pixel, margin on right 10 pixel, margin on the bottom 10 pixel, and margin on the left 10 pixel. What we have here is this nicely laid out element. If we don't specify the width, it's just going to be div element and all block element by default are going to take up the entire width of the screen, unless you specify a margin. Like say we have margin left set to 100, that I mean margin right set to 100, and you can see that there is not taking up the entire width of the screen anymore. It's only taking up the entire width of the screen that doesn't contain this 100 pixel on the right side. But if we don't specify that much margin, it's gonna just take up the entire width of the screen. And if we specify a width, you can see that it's now taking up the width that we specified. All makes sense, right? A way you can center your element is through margin. I'm going to remove this line. There's 3 shorthand for margin. The first one will be you do margin and you specify top, left, right, top, right, bottom, left. And in the area here, you're gonna input in pixel or percentage, and you're basically saying the margin on top should be this, the margin on right should be this. So like we can say 10 pixels for top, just like that. The other shorthand is margin X and Y. This means that this will be your margin on both the top and the bottom. So that's why I say it's X, or top and bottom. And the second value will be, oh, sorry. Yeah, yes. The second value will be, sorry, it's not X, it's actually Y. It's not Y, it's actually X. The second value will be left and right. So you have 2 values. For our top and bottom, we want 50 pixel. Let me remove this dash and remove this line. For our left and right, this we could actually type in auto. Let me just see if we don't type in auto. You can see that if we specify the margin left and right to 100 pixel, we have this huge space between left and between right. And we specify the X and Y margin to 50 pixel, and that is why between the top and the bottom, between the very top of our HTML page and our first element, there's a space of 50 pixel. And between the first one and the second one, there are a space of 50 pixel. You can see that this margin between them collapsed. Theoretically, it should add up to 100 pixel, right? Between the bottom margin of div 1 and the top margin of div2, but there's a thing called margin collapse, which combines this margin together. So even though you have this element, the div1 margin bottom to 50, div2 margin top to 50, it won't add up to 100 pixel. Instead, it will just collapse to 50 pixel. To prevent that, just add some padding. Now you can see that, yeah, or some more element between them. The difference between margin is that padding is the space between the border and your actual content. Your actual content is just the text you define here. So in our div1, the actual content is this I highlighted. And padding will just be the space between the text and the border. Margin, on the other hand, will be the distance between the element and other elements. So margin is outside of the border. Let me just show you. So this is a very good graph. Padding is in an element, the distance between the element content and the border, and margin is just the space between two elements outside of their border. So you can think of it as like the distance between the border of this element and the border of that element. That's another two vocabulary, margin and padding. To center this, we simply say auto. What auto does is that it takes our width into account and it automatically calculates a value of width that could center our element. So just remember, if you put auto to the y value, you can see if this is centered. This basically automatically calculates a margin on the left and a margin on the right that will center your element. We could also do it by hand, of course. I will eyeball it. 50 pixel, oh, too much. 450 pixel, too much. 400 pixel. Yeah, you can see that we can also do it by hand. So I input 400 pixel, which means the distance from the left of the document to the element will be 400 pixel, and the distance from the element to the right of the document will also be 400 pixel. And this way you can see that we centered it almost. But this isn't responsive. The best way is just to use auto. Just automatically center it for you. I believe this also if you have multiple elements stacked, then it won't work. But if you have only one element, then you could also put auto on the height, and that will probably center it based on your parent container. So float left. And you can see it stacked up. So that is just the power of float. You know that in modern website we have, actually let me explain the float more. If we do float right, they all stack to the right. The first element, of course, is on the very right, since div1 is defined on the first, div2 to the second, and div3 to the very left. This is because we're doing float right. If we do float left, you can see div1 is actually on the very left. Now, I don't want every div to be float left. So notice here in my CSS file, I am going to change the selector to dot. Remember, dot is a selector that allows you to select a class. Oh, I see a mark. Okay, never mind. It's kind of dark. So a dot allows you to select the class. So I'm just dot float, and I'm gonna give the class dot float to all of the Okay, so I give the class float. This, we explained this in the first lesson. I give the class float to all of the div here. And in my CSS, I use a class selector dot float to select all of the element with class float, which is these three. You can see it highlighted for me in the browser. All right, dot float, okay. Let me show you what happens if we have another div that is not float. And we want to give us some styling to this too, so no float is on top, all the way up there. I'm gonna remove the margin for the div so you can see this better. And for no float, I'm gonna copy and paste all the styling that makes a div a box to the no float. Interesting how no float isn't selecting it. All right, it might not be that visible, but if I remove this, you can see that even though we have no float defined here, and it's perfectly fine, and if we remove the string float element, we can see that we have this no float here, right? So this is our no float element, and it's in the normal document float. Oh, the program is called brackets, but you can use repo. If you want, you can download it, but I would recommend using bracket, but for now you could just use repo or whatever you want. All right, this is just my code editor, the code editor I like to use. So you can see that I have the no float here, and yeah, it's displaying normally. It's in the normal document float. And if I get the string float element back, you can see it disappeared. Well, it actually didn't disappear. It got covered up by the first div element. So if I make the width larger, height larger, you can see the no float is actually beneath the string div element, string floating element. This is just how it works. If you take some element out of the normal flow, it's gonna stick to the very left and of the container. Whatever comes beneath it, if it is in the normal document flow, then it's gonna be as if this is not here and be on the very top. So you can think of it as having different layer. There's a float to the left layer, and there's a float normal document flow layer. And they won't interact with each other. So that's why the normal document flow layer is starting on the left, very top too. Makes the height smaller, 100 pixel, 50 pixel. You can see that we have, I make the height larger. Move. You can really see that it's being covered by the three float elements. If I remove those three, you can clearly see that it's here. But since we have the three float element here, it's covering it up. If those elements aren't float, this happen. And if they are flow, they're being pulled out of the normal document flow, and they're gonna stack to the left. So it's very simple like that. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go to IExplore website and look at this amazing website. I wonder who made it. And I'm gonna try to recreate this here. You can obviously see that these are actually one big container, and those are 3 small div elements. The reason that they're not displaying this way, but displaying this way, is because they're specified to float. It's actually because I'm using Bootstrap Grid and Flexbox, but that's another technology. We can achieve the same things through float. So I'm gonna go back to here, and I'm going to try to recreate this thing. Let's go back to my bracket page. All right. I recommend you follow along. We had these 3 divs here, and I'm gonna delete them all. And I'm gonna make another div, and this will be our parent container, like the overall container that contains the other 3 of our div elements. So this div, I'm gonna give a class of container. Delete all my previous CSS. Dot container, selecting my container class. Margin, I'm gonna give it a width of 80%. This just means the width of 80% of the screen, or 80% of the parent element, which is body, which is just the entire screen. So I'm just telling it to have 80% of the entire document width. If I do a background color, oops, I need to give it a height as well. So height, we're gonna set it to auto later. For now, to see the color, I'm gonna set it to 500 pixel. All right, you can see it's something like this. We start from the very left. Since the body tag has a little bit of padding there, there's a little bit of space, and we have width to 80% of the screen sides, and then the rest is left blank. So this part that's being colored is 80% of our width. So those are the width specified, and those are the non-specified width. You can see it's exactly 80% of the screen size, right? And we want to center it. So we'll do margin 0, since the first one is margin top and down, and we don't want to specify them. Auto, and auto just center it. And you can see that instantly, we have this, the blue is like outlining my margin, and you can see I have margin on the both sides, same margin width automatically calculated by the browser to center my giant doc element here. Yeah. This is gonna be my container. And if I go back to this amazing website, IExploreUse.org, by the way. To this amazing website, you can see we have 3 div elements here that we want to put, right? Because those for sure are 3 div elements, and this is probably a H1 element, because I say probably because I wonder who made this. But we have a paragraph element, and this, let me just take a look. Never mind. This is, I'm assuming that I don't know who made it. Never mind. This is just a H1 element and paragraph element. Those are some icons. I took them from Font Awesome. Icon Awesome, I think. And this website I give you icons. And this is probably H1, and this is a paragraph. So we have 3 divs, each div containing an icon, H1, and a paragraph, and the second div same idea. So I'm just gonna make one div first. And after that, I can copy and paste the div 3 times. And class to small part. Actually, I'm naming it service. No. What should I name it? Naming stuffs are hard. All right, just name it name. Yeah, because I'm too lazy to come up with a good name. And you don't need to indent HTML. I indented it because it looks better. And I have a H1. What did it say here? Passion. All right, passion offered. I'm gonna copy and paste the paragraph. You can just write whatever you want. And I'm gonna make another child element. This time is paragraph, and I'm gonna copy and paste the paragraph here. So inside our div container, we have a div that is called name because I'm terrible at getting names. We have inside this child element, it itself is actually a parent container of these two elements, H1 and this passion and paragraph tag of a paragraph. And let me go back to my, oops. Where's my stuff? All right, you can see our passion looks like this. It's very ugly. I'm gonna copy and paste this 3 times. So I take my name div here, note, I'm taking my name div here, and I select all of the name div, including the H1, the paragraph, and the name div, and the enclosing tag. Make sure you have to select the enclosing tag, the slash div as well, because that's the entire HTML element. So you select the div, the tag here, and also the slash div. That's very important. And copy and paste it 2 times. So that's what I have now. And you can see there's a bit of text overflow here. And that is because we set the height to 300 pixels. If we just set the height to auto, then the height will be automatically calculated based on the child's, and therefore we won't have any overflow. By default, the height is set to auto, so we don't need to actually do anything. All right. Very ugly, but that's fine. Background color, I'm not gonna do gray. I'm just gonna do white. And I'm gonna make a selector for the name class. Remember, this div, all these 3 divs has a class of name. So by using a class selector that selects name, I'm actually selecting all, I'm actually selecting all the 3 div tags here. I selected this because this has a class of name. And I also selected this because this also has a class of name. And so I'm just selecting every div element with a class of name. But you can see it appeared on my browser for a brief moment. But hopefully you get this. If you don't get this, draw a question mark. At any point, if you don't get a part, just draw a question mark on the screen. You can see the passion is labeling the 3 div here. Okay. Does everyone get this? If you get this, please do a check mark on the screen. So like you can go to your annotation tool and draw a check mark. All right, thank you. So thank you very much. Arigato or gracias. All right, thank you for drawing the check mark. So I'm gonna apply some styling to all the 3 div containers that contain these paragraphs. So this div is a parent container, and it contains the header and the paragraph. Those are its child, and this div is the parent container. So I'm gonna apply some styling. First of all, I'm gonna specify a width so that it could actually flow. So I'm gonna set the width to 30%. This 30% is the 30% of this 80% here. So if you calculate it, 3.3 multiplied by 0.8, 0.24. That means each name will take up 0.24, 24% of the entire screen. So yeah, since this percentage operator gets percentage unit gets a percentage of the parent container, and since the parent container of name div is this div with class container, so I will repeat that the parent container of all of these divs is this, right? And since this has a width of 80% and we're getting 30% of that with 80%, that means it's 0.3 multiplied by 0.8. A little bit math and they give us 0.24. So it's 24% of the entire screen. So 30%, we choose 30% because there are 3 and 3 multiplied by 30 equals to 90 and close to 100%. And yeah, that's it. And do our magical float to left. All right, you can see we have this cool stuff looking perfect. What's the difference between this and this? Well, I believe this is already looking fine. So yeah. Passion. I'm gonna actually make another container to do more practice. So div, we can reuse the previous class we made called container, class container. We can reuse this class, and I'm making a new section for my web page. So on top of this previous container, we have made a new container. In this container, I'm trying to achieve something like this. Ah, beautiful website. So where we have paragraph on the left and an image on the right. All right, so that's div class to. This time we can't reuse the class name because we have defined the width to only 30%. And since we only have 2, the width must be bigger, right? The width must be like around 50%. So we make a new class called wrapper. I'm calling it wrapper because I don't know. I don't like giving names. And let me define a style for wrapper. So I will go to my CSS dot wrapper width to 50%. So around the half of the screen, since we only have 2, right? We only have this div, and the image here is actually a div. So half of the screen. And float left. And float left, and we're gonna bring back this stuff. Header. I'm gonna copy and paste the passion header because I don't want to, yeah. Oops. What went wrong? Okay, so we have this stuff here. This isn't supposed to happen, but since it happened, to fix this, I'm gonna do clear. Actually. All right, never mind. Okay, let's just see what happens next. Because what's happening right now, because the wrapper has left enough space on the right side, this passion, since it's also float left, is actually floating to the left side of this, which isn't supposed to happen. So let's see. To fix this, we could simply make another wrapper. So we have two elements on the same row, right? And therefore, this wrapper takes up this entire width, so there's no more space. That's why the passion is being put on this side. Very simple, right? And we have two wrappers. So now you can see we have a really good looking website. Not really good looking, but kind of cool. We have 3 passion, 2 wrapper. And instead of wrapper, I'm actually going to use the image tag. Or even better, actually, I'm just going to use it. To make an image tag, just make a tag, img, and then you need to specify a source. The source could be online image. I'm going to go to unsplash.com, which is a free image source hosting website. I'm going to select an image. This one looks pretty, actually, this one looks better. And I'm going to right click, copy image address. Since this image is being hosted on the cloud, by copying this image address, I can actually get the image in my image tag. So I'm going to click copy image address. Go back to my bracket. Boom, and copy and paste the image address there. Resize this window. This is not resizing. There you go. All right, you can see I have wrapper, and on the left, this also takes up 50% because this has a container of wrapper as well, which is with 50% float left. But you can see the image is kind of too big. We can specify the height of the image here at the image tag called height. We want it to be 250. All right. So remember, a source of your image is basically where the image is hosted. Your browser is kind of like your link sheet, if you will. It's kind of like that. So your browser will make a request to a server that's running on this locator, and it will locate that resource and make a request to that server. In this case, the server is unsplash.com, and then make a request unsplash.com and request this specific image hosted at this address. And unsplash.com will give us the image. After receiving the image on our server side, it will render it. That's it. All right, that's all for today's lesson. Thank you guys all for coming.